On a cold Tuesday morning in November 2019, a group of school administrators gathered in the parking lot of Jefferson Elementary School in Dayton, Ohio. They were there to say goodbye to a man who had mopped those hallways for 31 years. They brought a sheet cake from Kroger. They sang an off-key version of "For He's a Jolly Good Fellow." They shook his hand and handed him a small gold-colored watch. His name was Earl Hutchins. He was 67 years old. He stood 5'9", wore the same blue uniform he'd worn every day for 3 decades, and made just under $32,000 a year. And nobody in that parking lot knew that the man they were celebrating, the man with the mop and the quiet smile and the thermos of black coffee, had just quietly, completely, and permanently walked away from work with $1.2 million sitting in investment accounts. Nobody asked. Nobody would have guessed. That is the story we are about to tell you. And by the time it's done, you are going to look at money, at time, and at the ordinary moments of an ordinary life in a way you never have before. Earl grew up in a 2-bedroom house on the east side of Dayton, the second of 4 kids. His father worked at a parts warehouse. His mother cleaned hotel rooms on weekends. Money was not something the Hutchins family discussed. It was something they survived. Earl was not a bad student. He wasn't a great one either. He graduated from Dunbar High School in 1970 with no real plan, no college savings, and no idea what came next. He worked odd jobs for a couple of years: gas station, grocery store, a brief and unsuccessful attempt at selling insurance door to door. Then, in 1988, at the age of 36, he got hired as a custodian at Jefferson Elementary. The pay wasn't impressive. The hours were early. The work was physical and largely invisible, the way a lot of important work is. But Earl was reliable. He showed up. He did the job. And in the 3rd month of his employment, something happened that would change the entire trajectory of his life. Even though it didn't feel like much at the time, the school district sent a pamphlet home with his first real paycheck. It was printed on cheap paper and folded in thirds. Most of his co-workers threw theirs away without reading it. Earl didn't. The pamphlet was about the district's 403B retirement plan. For those of you who don't know, a 403B is basically the government and non-profit sector version of a 401k. You contribute money before taxes, it goes into investment funds, and it grows tax-deferred for decades. The district would match the first 3% of whatever Earl put in. Earl sat at his kitchen table that night, alone, no television on, and read that pamphlet 3 times. He didn't fully understand everything in it, but he understood one sentence near the bottom of the 2nd page. It said, in plain language, that if you contributed consistently over a long period of time, even small amounts could grow into something significant because of a concept called compound interest. Earl had heard that phrase before, maybe in passing, but reading it there, in that kitchen, with the sound of the neighborhood outside and exactly $412 in his checking account, something clicked. He thought about his parents. He thought about how they worked their entire lives and still never had anything to show for it. He thought about how his father, at 71 years old, had to keep picking up shifts at the warehouse because Social Security wasn't enough to cover the bills. Earl decided right then that he was not going to let that happen to him. The next morning, he went to the HR office and filled out the paperwork to contribute 6% of his salary to the 403B. 6% of $31,000 was less than $2,000 a year, less than $40 a week. His co-workers thought he was crazy. One of them, a man named Gerald, told him he should be enjoying his money now, not giving it to some fund manager in a city he'd never visit. Earl smiled, nodded, and changed nothing. The first 5 years were not dramatic. Earl's account grew slowly. Some months, the balance went up. Some months, when the market had a rough stretch, it went down. Earl checked it maybe 4 times a year, wrote the number in a small notebook he kept in his nightstand, and went back to work. But here is what was happening during those quiet, unremarkable years. Here is the thing most people miss. The money was working. Every dollar Earl put in was buying tiny ownership stakes in hundreds of American companies through the index funds his 403B offered. And those companies were paying dividends. And those dividends were being automatically reinvested. And those reinvested dividends were generating their own returns. It was slow. It was invisible. It was the most powerful financial force in the world. Earl didn't feel rich in 1990. 1993, he drove a 1987 Chevrolet Caprice with 140,000 miles on it. He packed his lunch every single day. He lived in a small apartment off Salem Avenue and paid $450 a month in rent. He did not take vacations. He did not have cable television. But inside that 403B, something extraordinary was beginning to form. In 1996, Earl's balance crossed $20,000 for the first time. He sat with that number for a long time. He had never had $20,000 in his life. He had never been in the same room as $20,000 in cash. And here it was, his, legally, officially, growing quietly in an account he almost never touched. He pulled out that small notebook and flipped back to the first entry. His starting balance from 1988 had been zero. In 8 years, contributing less than $40 a week, he had built $20,000. He did some rough math on the back of an envelope. Not sophisticated math. Earl was not a financial professional, but he understood the basic idea. If $20,000 could grow to $40,000 in roughly the same period, and $40,000 to $80,000 and $80,000 to $160,000, he wrote down numbers that felt almost impossible. Then he did something that most people never do. He didn't just write down the dream. He increased his contribution. Earl bumped his contribution from 6% to 9% of his salary. That meant another $40 a month. Money he found by canceling a subscription to a magazine he wasn't reading and by switching his car insurance to a cheaper provider. He didn't suffer for it. He barely noticed, but the account noticed. The late 1990s were a boom time in America. The stock market surged on the back of the tech revolution. Earl's balance climbed faster than he had expected. By 1999, his account was approaching $60,000. And then the bottom fell out. The dot-com crash of 2000 and 2001 was brutal. Earl watched 20% of his balance evaporate in less than 18 months. His notebook entries went quiet. He stopped writing the numbers down for a while because he didn't want to see them. One Saturday morning in the spring of 2001, he sat in his apartment and held that notebook and had a conversation with himself that would define the rest of his financial life. He thought about pulling the money out. He thought about it seriously. He'd heard people at work talking about doing exactly that, cutting their losses, taking what was left, putting it in a savings account where at least it couldn't go down. Gerald had already done it. Gerald had cashed out his 403B, paid the penalties and taxes, and used the money to put a pool in his backyard. Earl sat there for a long time. Then he thought about that first pamphlet. He thought about compound interest. He thought about his father at 71, still working. He thought about time, about how he still had 15 to 20 years of work ahead of him, and how the market had recovered from every crash in American history. He closed the notebook. He did not touch the account. He kept contributing. The market recovered. It always does, given enough time and enough patience. By 2005, Earl's balance had not only recovered from the crash, it had surpassed his pre-crash high. The money he had kept contributing during the downturn, the contributions he made in 2001 and 2002 when the market was at its lowest, had bought into investments at bargain prices and then rode the recovery back up. That is the part nobody tells you about bear markets. The people who stay calm and keep buying during the crash are often the ones who benefit most from the recovery. Earl didn't have a financial advisor to explain this to him. He learned it by living it. By 2008, he had crossed $200,000. And then the financial crisis hit. The crash of 2008 was worse than 2001. It was faster, deeper, and more terrifying. Earl was 56 years old, and for the first time, he felt fear, real fear, about his retirement savings. This was not abstract anymore. He was getting older. He did not have unlimited time to let the market recover. His balance dropped from over $200,000 to around $130,000 in less than a year. He told no one. There was no one to tell. Earl had never married. He had a sister in Columbus and some friends from work, but he wasn't the kind of man who talked about money. He carried this alone. He went back to work every morning. He mopped floors. He fixed stuck locker doors. He changed fluorescent bulbs in the gymnasium. He listened to the kids in the hallways, their noise and their energy, and he thought about what kind of future they would have, and what kind of future he was building for himself. And once again, he did not withdraw the money. He kept contributing, even as the account fell, even as co-workers retired early with nothing because they had never saved, even as the news told him the economy was broken. He kept putting that money in every paycheck, buying into a market that was on sale, that nobody wanted, that felt like it might never come back. By 2012, his account had not only recovered, but had exceeded $300,000. Something shifted in Earl around 2013. He was 61 years old, and for the first time in his life, he began to realize that the impossible number, the number he had written on the back of that envelope in his kitchen in 1996, might actually be reachable. He started reading more. He found books at the Dayton Metro Library about index fund investing. He learned about asset allocation, about gradually shifting money from aggressive stock funds to more conservative bond funds as retirement approached. He made adjustments slowly and carefully. He also discovered something called a Roth IRA. He was able to contribute an additional $6,500 per year, money that would grow tax-free and could be withdrawn in retirement without any tax bill. He had a little money in a regular savings account he'd built up over the years. He started moving it, methodically, into a Roth. Nobody had ever told him about Roth IRAs. No one had sat him down as a young man and explained any of this. He was 61 years old when he learned how to use this tool, and he was grateful, genuinely grateful, that he had found it even then, because even 6 years of tax-free growth matters. In 2015, Earl's combined accounts crossed $500,000. He was sitting in his car in the school parking lot when he logged into the account on his phone and saw the number. He had gotten a smartphone 2 years earlier, used from a kid in the neighborhood who was upgrading. He sat in that car, in his blue uniform, in the school parking lot, and he looked at the number for a long time. $500,000. He thought about Gerald, who had cashed out in 2001 and put in the pool. Gerald had retired at 62 with only Social Security and a small pension. He was doing okay, but he wasn't free. Not the way Earl was starting to feel free. Earl had never been a man who chased luxury. He still drove a used car. He still packed his lunch. He still lived simply. But he began to understand, for the first time, that the choices he had made, not the big dramatic choices, but the small, daily, unremarkable choices, had been compounding just like his money. Every time he had chosen not to panic. Every time he had chosen to contribute instead of spend. Every time he had chosen patience over instant relief. All of it had accumulated. He was not a rich man's son. He had never earned a salary that would turn heads. He had never gotten a windfall or an inheritance or a lucky break. He had simply started early enough, stayed consistent long enough, and trusted the math long enough, and the math had delivered. The last 4 years before Earl's retirement were the most powerful of his investing life. Not because he changed his strategy, he didn't, but because of what the financial world calls the snowball effect. When your base is large enough, even modest market returns produce enormous absolute gains. In 2016, the market returned roughly 12%. 12% of $500,000 is $60,000. More than Earl earned in a full year of work. His account had effectively employed an invisible assistant that earned as much as he did. He kept working because he wanted to, and because the health insurance was good, and because he genuinely liked the school. He liked the way the building smelled in the morning before the kids arrived. He liked the younger custodians he'd helped train over the years. He wasn't miserable. He simply knew that when the time came, the decision would be his. By early 2019, his total balance across the 403B and the Roth IRA had crossed $1 million. Earl checked the number on a Sunday evening, sitting in his same apartment. He'd never moved. The rent had only risen to $720, and he cried. Not dramatically, just quietly, alone, the way he had done everything. He thought about his mother. He thought about her hands, roughened from hotel cleaning supplies. He thought about how she never had a retirement account. How she never had anything to protect her when she got old. He thought about how she would have felt seeing this number. He wiped his eyes and went to bed. He worked until November 2019, 9 months past the $1 million mark, just to be sure, just to add a little more cushion, a little more certainty. His final balance, calculated the week before the retirement party in the parking lot, was $1.2 million. 3. He had earned $32,000 a year. He had saved 9% of it for most of his career. He had invested in basic, boring index funds. He had never pulled the money out during a crash. He had added to a Roth IRA in his later years. He had let time and compound growth do what they do when you don't interfere with them. That's the whole story. No tricks, No shortcuts. No secret strategy that only wealthy people know. After retirement, Earl moved into a small house. He bought it outright. A modest place in the south end of Dayton. Nothing fancy. A yard with a garden. He travels occasionally. He visits his sister in Columbus. He volunteers twice a week at a community center near his old school. He lives on roughly $2,000 a month, drawing from his retirement accounts in a way designed to make the money last for 30-plus years. His financial situation is not just stable, it is abundant by any measure that matters to him. People in his neighborhood know him as the retired guy with the vegetable garden. They don't know about the accounts. He doesn't advertise it. That is not who Earl is. But sometimes, when a young person asks him about money, a neighbor's kid, a young man from the community center, Earl pauses and thinks about that pamphlet. That cheap, fold-in-thirds pamphlet that most of his co-workers threw in the trash in 1988. And he tells them the same thing every time. He tells them that they don't need a big salary. They don't need a financial advisor in an expensive suit. They don't need a hot stock tip or a real estate deal or a side hustle that replaces their income overnight. What they need is to start. Start now. With whatever they have, even $20 a paycheck. Because the thing most people don't understand about compound growth is that it isn't about the amount you put in. It's about the time you give it to work. He tells them that the first $100 they invest is worth more than the last $1,000. Because the first 100 has decades to multiply, and the last 1,000 barely has time to breathe. He tells them not to panic when the market drops. He tells them that every crash in American history has been followed by a recovery, and that the investors who got rich were not the ones who were smart enough to see the crash coming. They were the ones who were patient enough to stay through it. He tells them that the enemy of wealth is not a low income. It is impatience. It is the belief that if you can't get there fast, you can't get there at all. He tells them that the most powerful financial tool any of them will ever have is not a stock tip or a business idea. It is time. And time is the one thing that money can never buy back. Earl Hutchins spent 31 years mopping floors at a public elementary school in Dayton, Ohio. He never earned a salary that would impress anyone at a dinner party. He never drove a new car or lived in a big house or wore a watch worth more than $30. But on the morning of his retirement, while his co-workers ate sheet cake in the November cold and sang off-key, Earl Hutchins was free. Completely, permanently, undeniably free. Not because of luck. Not because of privilege. Not because of anything that was handed to him. Because of a pamphlet. Because of a decision. Because of 31 years of showing up, to work, and to the quiet, patient discipline of letting his money grow. The school still stands on the same street in Dayton. The hallways are still swept by custodians who show up before the kids arrive and leave after the lights go out. Most of them haven't read the pamphlet. Most of them won't. But some of them will. And for those few, everything will be different. That is what this story is about. Not about Earl Hutchins specifically, though he deserves to have his story told. It is about the gap between what most people believe is possible for someone like them and what is actually possible given time and discipline and the courage to trust a process that works too slowly to feel real until the day it becomes undeniable. You do not need to be exceptional to build wealth in America. You need to be patient. You need to be consistent. You need to start. Whatever you earn, whether it is $32,000 a year or twice that, there is a version of Earl's story that belongs to you. The accounts are available. The index funds are available. The power of compound growth is available to anyone who is willing to leave the money alone long enough to let it work. The only question is whether you will start today or whether you will wait until tomorrow, and then the day after that, and then one day realize that the one thing you cannot buy more of is the time you have already spent. Earl Hutchins did not wait, and in the end, that was the only difference that mattered.